Good morning and welcome to Second. All of you here in the sanctuary and those of you who are joining us on Zoom. It's really exciting to be worshiping again in the sanctuary and also in so many different formats. I think that's been one of the gifts of COVID. It's opened that up for us. This morning, I want to share a scripture with you from Second Corinthians. In this letter that Paul wrote to the Corinthians, he was in a transitional space with them. He had had some kind of a disagreement with the church in Corinth, and we don't have the letter that describes that disagreement. We just have Paul referring to it. But we know he was in kind of a liminal space, and so he writes this letter to them, and he says, Jesus says to us, "My grace is all you need. My power is strongest when you are weak. So if Christ keeps giving me his power, then I will gladly brag about how weak I am. Yes, I'm glad to be weak or insulted or mistreated or to have troubles and sufferings if it is for Christ. Because when I am weak, I am strong." This is the word of the Lord. So I have to be honest that there is a little voice deep inside me that comes from my gut, that comes from my lower self, when it hears the words, "Because when I'm weak, I am strong," that says, thanks but no thanks. I'd rather be confident, not anxious. I'd rather be strong and not weak. I'd rather have order and not chaos. I would rather not have to rely on grace. I'd rather rely on my own strength and my own abilities. So our message today is entitled, "The Art of Losing." It's from a courageous poem written by Elizabeth Bishop, and I'd encourage you to maybe Google that and read it when you have time. We've had a year of experiencing losing in a big way. Suffering, enduring loss, resenting losing, and sometimes even growing through losing. Many of us have learned that the art of losing is really an art. It's not a skill that we can master, but it is an art that we have to develop. It's a process that we can't control, but it's more like a ride that we have to take, like a roller coaster ride. And it's an inevitable part of the human experience. And so humans tend to respond to loss in different ways according really to the depth of our own self-awareness and our commitment to living healthily. We can cope with loss in very unhealthy ways, by running away, or turning to substances, by letting ourselves get lost in resentment, but we can also make different choices. And so this summer, we're exploring what the silver linings might have been for us during this pandemic time. And so we're referring to the Pandemic Linings Playbook. And also recently, Paul has referred to a great book by Kate Bowler, which you may have had the opportunity to read. It's called Everything Happens for a Reason. Now, Kate is a person who had to deal with a diagnosis in her early 30s. When she was at the top of her game, she had then and has now a stellar career at Duke University. Kate was married to her childhood sweetheart, and they were about ready to start their family when she was faced with a diagnosis of a terminal disease. And her book is a really powerful and honest account of what she discovered were the limits of faith when tragedy strikes. She says, "Cancer required that I stumble around in the debris of dreams that I thought I was entitled to, and plans that I didn't realize that I had made." And one of the reviewers of her book said, "Kate really knows, she really understands that someday death is going to win, but she stares it in the face, and she is learning how to handle the grief of this, and somehow to trust and continue to believe in God's goodness, to lean into the art of losing." Dr. Joan Borysenko calls this the sacrament of defeat. Dr. Joan is a graduate of Harvard Medical School and a pioneer in integrative medicine, and her work has been foundational in launching an international healthcare revolution that recognizes the role of the spiritual dimension of life in wellness and wholeness. Some of you, like me, are old enough to remember when that really was not part of it. And so now you can often, when you need support in healthcare, hear some reference to your social support and to your spiritual life. But that has been kind of a new, in the last 25 or 30 years, a new pioneering field. And she says, because gratification of desire leads to the temporary stilling of our anxiety. It leads to the temporary stilling of the mind. And when we get what we want, we have at least a temporary experience of inner peace and joy. She said, because of this, it's easy for us to get hooked on thinking that happiness arises from the satisfaction of desires. She said, this is the meaning of the sacrament of defeat, is when we come to understand that we're called to find peace, to find happiness, to find growth, to find even a deepening of our faith when we don't get our desires met. It helps us heal our addictions to constant gratification. Losing can give us an opportunity to experience happiness even when we lose, to find solace in our faith, to even find a deepening richness in that faith by way of the gifts found in defeat and deprivation and failure and suffering. And for a lot of us, this year of COVID has brought much of that. Now, I want to be clear that because we are called to and able to find growth and spiritual maturity in the experience of defeat, that does not mean that our suffering is a result of God's will for us. And it does not mean that we deserve this suffering because we need to grow. But it does mean that we can sometimes, maybe not always, but continue to live into finding those silver linings. And we don't even find them necessarily by looking for them, but we find them more by being quiet inside, by opening up space in our souls for something unexpected to visit us, or to occur to us, or to be born in us. We cannot create silver linings, but on our journey, we can discover them. And we know that discoveries can't be planned and orchestrated, but the discovery of silver linings in our lives can be something that we can tend to, that we can contemplate and make room for, and that we can integrate into our lives. So here at Second Church, we have an ongoing group that meets weekly that we call Spirituality and Practice. And our goal in that group is to learn to integrate spiritual practices into our daily lives. And that is a habit that doesn't create silver linings, but it creates more verdant space in our inner selves to discern the presence of Spirit, to hear that still small voice, and to be able to be led by that still small voice. So I thought this morning I would invite some of our group members to share some of their silver linings during this year of COVID. And friends, they delivered. I have so much information and feedback and marvelous stories that I can't possibly share them with you all today. And so I will be back in the pulpit in August, and so we're going to revisit this and share some of that. So I want to give a special thanks to Sue and Ellen and Sarah and Linda and those of you that sent me marvelous stories that I don't have time for today. But two of our group members volunteered to join us in person. And so they're going to share with you for a few minutes some reflections about what this year has brought them, some of the unexpected silver linings in dealing with the horror and the frustration and the incredible limits of the pandemic. So welcome Bev and Leslie. And Bev, I'm going to invite you to start.
Good morning. I'll just tell you my story. My husband and I had returned from Hawaii in mid-February of 2020 and noticed at our LA layover that many people were wearing masks. We knew that COVID might be coming to the US, but had no idea of the scope of what was going to unfold. I still had all of my activities and interests going until about 3 weeks later. The nonprofit that I volunteer with suddenly shut down in that 3 weeks. The next day, I tried to attend my aerobics class at the community center, and there were signs on the door that it was closed. The thrift stores all closed. Well, I'm a thrifter, so that was very important. Everyone was supposed to stay home as much as possible. The schools closed. I was used to having time on my hands after I retired, so this wasn't so devastating, but it was concerning. My husband and I decided to follow public health guidelines. We limited trips to the grocery store and eyed others with suspicion that they might also have the virus, or that we didn't, but that they might have the virus. The county required masks, and I knew that that would help, along with social distancing. All of our relatives are out of state, and we only see them a few times a year, but we missed them. My home life with my husband didn't change much. We're used to each other as retirees. It seemed like all of the news was worsening pandemic news for months. I'll outline some of the silver linings that I've discerned, and I hadn't really thought about it before doing this essay. The church I went to closed for public health reasons, and I had wondered about, if I wasn't able to go to the physical church, if my church relationships would continue. They did. I wondered what would happen to my church women's group. It morphed into Zoom. I felt like I'd been away on a long trip and had returned to familiar faces when we all learned how to Zoom a couple of months into the shutdown. Luckily, my husband and I are avid readers and share enjoyment of similar genres, and I ordered 20 used books on eBay, and I was expecting the long haul. I wasn't one of those that expected it to end in a couple of months, but it was winter anyway, so. And then had an escape activity at home because of our reading. My church aerobics group, which is different than my other aerobics group, couldn't meet inside of the church. So we decided to walk in the neighborhood around the church and make adjustments for the weather. Rain called for cancellation or umbrellas. I hadn't used an umbrella in years because I just, dodged from the car to where I was going. So that was kind of cool. No, my umbrella worked. When we were on our aerobics walks, we ran into people we knew and hadn't seen for a while. They were also trying to cope by taking walks. That was good to have something serendipitous be so positive. I was a nurse practitioner before my retirement and had worked as an operating room nurse, so masks were no big deal to me. I was already acquainted with the science behind virus transmission and understood aerosol and droplet vector concepts. I was careful and cautious, but not terrified of the unknown. I had cared for people during the AIDS pandemic, and I felt it was God's work, as I have for all of my nursing career, for other people as well as the AIDS pandemic victims. I had cared for people who had required respiratory precautions because of pneumonia, and so this was really no different than that for me. It was for everybody else that didn't happen to be an intensive care nurse and all that. I did struggle with those who seemed anti-science and anti-public health. I likened their behavior to indoor smoking in public places in the past. I felt that those people were either unable to grasp the scientific concepts of virus transmission, which are not elementary concepts, I will admit. Were not used to having to follow directions from anyone, were getting dangerous false information and believed it, or thought they would be spared because of their faith in God and not taking any precautions otherwise. Sociological trends in the modern culture also value extreme self-reliance and rugged individualism. Later, I added fear as a more forgivable reason for risky behaviors. I watched a webcast comparing this pandemic to the 1918 flu pandemic and discovered that public health recommendations were the same over, over 100 years ago. They were the same recommendations, except we have better masks now. And they didn't understand the aerosol concept yet. History showed that those communities who followed public health guidelines had less death and disease than those who didn't. The same proved true in Kansas. Those counties which chose not to follow recommendations had double the percentage of infections than those such as my county, which wisely followed public health guidelines. This does not excuse risky behavior policies now nor then, but help me to find some common ground for forgiveness of human nature. Other silver linings, although belated and bittersweet, included that nurses were finally nationally recognized for their courage, knowledge, and often invisible and largely thankless work. It is not just an exercise in thank you to all the nurses and all the healthcare people. It is not just an exercise in altruism to be a nurse. It is going towards the danger because it is their professional work and their job. Public health is a huge area for the profession. I was able to see part of my career choice valued a little more for that time by the public than I had ever seen before. That was healing to me. It was nice to see ordinary workers in grocery stores and so on get recognition for doing their jobs in dangerous conditions. I finally bought myself a bicycle that fits me. It was the last one left in stock and in my size for months to come. Everybody that couldn't go to the gyms anymore got on their bikes, including me. None of my friends or relatives died of COVID. I have a single friend who became part of my safe pod when we could dine out at restaurants again, and that was really a huge comfort for my friend and I. And my husband too. Pollution went way down during the shutdown, giving me a glimpse of what we need to do to save the planet and how reachable it is. Traffic was light for months. I loved that. A tank of gas lasted a long time because I wasn't going anywhere that was far away. We always spent Christmas alone, so there was no change there. It felt like others felt how a lonely holiday can be, but everyone was doing the same thing. I felt like we were all in this together, and we, even though we're apart, I felt a community, a sense of community. I went for a walk outside on the coldest day of 2021 and was able to stay warm enough from head to toe, and that had been something I'd been trying to do, like that was my Mount Everest. So, the U.S. has access to a vaccine for all, unlike Africa and most of the rest of the world at this point. All of my friends are vaccinated now. My volunteer work resumed. My social activities are back. I have been doing Melissa's spiritual study group by Zoom and enjoy a small group of attendees via Zoom locally as well as from out of state. I really benefit from the Christian fellowship and of thoughts of my fellow attendees, and Melissa is really an insightful spiritual growth facilitator for me. We just discussed forgiveness, and it made my way into this essay. This is furthering my journey as a Christian. I've started to forgive some who have endangered us all by their behavior during the pandemic, and I'm still working on that, but I'm making headway because we're all just human beings. We're all just God's children, and we make mistakes, and that's the way it is. And finally, we never ran out of toilet paper. I appreciated internet pandemic jokes. The cop goes to the robber hiding and says, "Come out with your hands washed." It felt good when my husband was able to score cleaning products or paper towels at the store. And it made me thankful for what I've always taken for granted before the pandemic. So I came out of it okay, and in some ways, better.
Wow. Well, I did run out of toilet paper. And a good friend in Boonville, Missouri, sent me 2 mega rolls in a shoebox. And I was eternally grateful because I couldn't go out at the time. I'm Leslie, and my story is a little bit different. It seems over the last 4 years, I've experienced 2 pandemics which occurred about 2 years apart. The first involved the illness and the death of my husband, Keith, and the second was COVID-19. Now, you might wonder why I would make such a strange and, in some ways, a hideous comparison. Well, both events lasted about a year, a little over a year. From first diagnosis to his death, Keith survived exactly 13 months and 2 days. The pandemic lasted about 14 months. And I felt tethered to each of those pandemics. We don't use the word tethered too often. Say it, tethered. It's not a comfortable word. I had no skill set to navigate either pandemic, even though I'm a plant pathologist, and yeah, I work with plant viruses, but public health was entirely different. Both events made me nauseous and sick to my stomach, and I lost weight. I lost the ability to follow a storyline in a novel, and so I couldn't read for pleasure, which I often did. And with Keith's illness, I couldn't concentrate enough to knit a garment to gauge. I've been knitting for almost 50 years. And in fact, I knitted the same sweater twice, and it was too big each time. So I finally gave it to my sister, who loves it. Well, both pandemics were gut-wrenchingly frightening, and I struggled to find a pathway. I'm one of these people that likes to know information. I couldn't navigate the pandemic, and many times I felt like I'd stepped right out into thin air. I was in trouble. And so I started asking questions, and the first one that I talked to was Dr. Neal. He was Keith's surgeon and a wonderful man, and he gave me the following advice. He said, remember, this is a marathon. It's not a race. And that all of a sudden made sense. That inquiry led me to more questions and discussions. I had a friend whose father was in and out of nursing homes before he passed away, and so I contacted her, and I said, I need to get Keith out of the hospital and into an acute care facility. Can you help me? And boy, did she. I asked a neighbor later on, after Keith had passed. She had lost her husband about a year before I did. And so I said, how do you navigate being a widow? I don't know that she had too many answers, but it was helpful. And so my silver lining is maybe I don't have all the answers up front, and maybe I don't have a pathway, but if I do have patience, if I put my pride aside and ask for help, the answers will eventually come. Thank you.
Bev and Leslie, thank you so much. Thank you so much. So even when that still small, weak voice in me says, thanks, but no thanks, I'll choose my own strength, there's still a greater voice, the presence and the counsel of Jesus Christ, who says, my grace is sufficient for you. I want to close this morning with this, sharing this quote by Mary Oliver, who's one of our most prolific and best read poets. She says, you can have the other words. You can have chance and luck. You can have coincidence and serendipity. I'll take grace. I don't know what it is exactly, but I'll take it. Amen.